And so the way that Brad put it is he said, we're all like steaks, we're all like these nice, rich and unique kind of steaks, but steaks are hard to study. And so what academic psychologists do is they sort of put us through a meat grinder and turn us into ground beef. And then, ground beef is easy to study. I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Welcome to the Deliberating Practice Podcast. I am your host, Glenn Wood, joined as always by your other host, Richard Tadamir. Good evening, Richard. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well, Glenn. How are you?
I'm doing great. And Richard, we're not alone tonight, are we? We have a special guest. Do you want to introduce our guest to our listeners?
Yeah, I'm excited to. This is Anthony Hull Kennedy. He is a graduate student at Simon Fraser University in counseling psychology. And Anthony and I have met over the last year or so on some mutual interests around deconstructing the self and having lots of philosophical and existential discussions. And so I'm really excited for him to discuss a bit about Philip Cushman and deconstructing the self in America. Anthony, anything else you want to say?
No, thank you, Richard. I really appreciate the warm welcome to the podcast. It's great to be on.
Yeah, welcome, Anthony. We're happy to have you tonight. And as Richard alluded to, our episode tonight focuses on the work of a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst named Philip Cushman and his book, Constructing the Self, Constructing America. So we're going to be talking about kind of the central thesis of the book and its implications for the world of psychotherapy and the work that we do. And so, yeah, maybe we can lean into that. And Anthony, how about you start by just giving us a little sense of who Philip Cushman is? You brought this sort of piece to us. This was sort of your recommendation that we dig into this book. So why don't we start with there, and then we'll get into what Cushman's all about.
Yeah. So Philip Cushman, as you mentioned, he's a psychoanalyst, hailing from the relational tradition of psychoanalytic theory. In this work, Constructing the Self, Constructing America, he's taking a historical look at how psychotherapy practices in the United States developed, in what political, social, and economic conditions they arose and were influenced by. And he wants us to have an understanding of these political, economic, and social functions of the way that practice was chosen to work, what sort of trends became dominant, and for what reason, so that we can gain a better understanding of why we do what we do and how we might be able to do it differently.
Yeah, that's well said, Anthony. Thanks for that introduction. And so just in line with that, I think the sort of central thesis of our episode tonight is the notion that Philip Cushman puts forward that psychotherapy, his consideration or the way that he views psychotherapy is probably different than the way that our listeners do and that a lot of other people out there view psychotherapy. I think like the predominant position in our culture around psychotherapy today is that we see psychotherapy as the product of a scientific process, that it's sort of the way that we practice psychotherapy today is sort of structured around empirical research and scientific findings and understandings of what makes people, what causes people to suffer and what is most helpful in alleviating their suffering. And a lot of people sort of consider this as kind of an objective process and also an acultural and ahistorical process. So one that isn't belonging to or isn't embedded in a particular cultural flame or doesn't have any type of sort of political structure to it. And I think Cushman's saying kind of the opposite. He wants to argue that psychotherapy is a cultural artifact, so that it's sort of embedded in, responsive to, structured around a particular sort of cultural configuration, political configuration. It's not really something he sees as separate from, or that can be understood completely as separate from the sort of cultural movement or sort of cultural structure around it, and that this actually has very important implications for the work we do.
And that's what we're going to get into more, Glenn. So
And that's what we're going to get into more. And yeah, so
Okay.
this notion of sort of psychotherapy embedded in a particular cultural or social or political structure has important implications for the work we do, and that's sort of what we're going to talk about more throughout the episode. Yeah. Yeah, and so maybe as a start, you guys, tonight, we can start to just look at the question of sort of how it is Cushman came to this position. Because, like I said, his position is a very different one. There's a lot implicit in that position. And, he does a good job of sort of explaining that. But why don't we bring to our listeners some of the key points that informed Cushman's positions that psychotherapy is a cultural artifact?
Yeah. And firstly, I think, Glenn, you put it very well when you were saying, maybe the dominant view might be that psychotherapy exists as something that was arrived at through hard scientific processes. Whereas I think Cushman would say no such objective procedure could arrive at an adequate explanation, prediction, elaboration of human subjective experience. That objectivity can't reach subjectivity, or if it can, it can graze it, it can reduce it, but never could it capture the sort of transcendent experience of subjectivity.
I just want to jump in with a little anecdote that I think supports that point,
Mm-hmm.
Anthony.
Mm-hmm.
I had a professor in my undergrad, Brad Piccola, at VIU. I don't know if he still works there now, but he was a critical psychologist. I feel very fortunate to have worked under Brad and learned from Brad. He was really awesome. So he lectured a lot on this sort of exact problem in sort of general psychology, right? The idea of like, we're kind of, in a basic sense, we are subjective beings.
Mm-hmm.
And he would also argue cultural and historical beings, right? And so we can't really extract that feature from ourselves without losing the essence of what we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when psychology focuses too much, when academic psychologists or scientific psychologists focus too much on trying to structure their research in a way that's objective, they actually end up often eliminating or taking out elements of human experience that are actually are really important and can't really be eliminated without destroying the possibility of understanding it. And so the way that Brad put it is, he said, we're all like steaks, we're all like these nice, rich and unique kind of steaks, but steaks are hard to study. And so what academic psychologists do is they sort of put us through a meat grinder and turn us into ground beef. And then, ground beef is easy to study. So now we can sort of study ground beef. And then all the conclusions that we come to, though, are based on the idea that we're ground beef, but we're not ground beef, we're steaks, right? So there's something that always feels a little bit wrong about the conclusions that academic psychologists or scientific psychologists come to, because they are kind of like our experience, but never really match our experience as we are, So I thought that was a funny metaphor and just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Anthony.
No. It's a grim metaphor, but I think it matches Cushman's sentiment about how deleterious and harmful these erasures that academic psychology has committed itself to. The effect of that. So yeah, no, I think that metaphor is well taken.
Yeah. I think there's something in that of the idea that the cultural, the historical, these are actually essential parts of human psychology. They're not just factors or variables that sort of can or cannot be considered. They're certainly not noise either, something to be eliminated because they're getting in the way of the true objective sort of facts about psychology. The argument here is that these are essential elements of who we are, that we can't really understand our psychology without understanding our culture.
I'm hearing echoes here from the great psychotherapy debate that I know the two of you discussed with Jonathan Shedler when he's arguing, to study truly meaningful therapy, you need to not have these controlled experiment level psychotherapies where there's nobody that has concurrent disorders and there's no, like these sorts of conditions that, what do they get called? The researcher practitioner gap. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that episode, which we did not that long ago, I really love that about Shedler, right? Like his notion that psychotherapy ought to be meaningful and it ought to be about people's lives and it ought to kind of contain the whole mess. The mess is sort of like important in some ways, right? And so this idea that we can kind of manufacture a therapy process that can be done in the short term, 8 to 16 sessions, and sort of hand it out to everyone as though everyone will be responsive to it in an equal way, is, it didn't fit Shedler's mode either.
Mm.
Okay, let's come back to the question that we were still trying to answer, which is how did Cushman come to his position? So, Anthony, I like what you said about the Cushman sense is, okay, we can't actually take an objective position. We can't actually come to a place of objectivity, nor ought we to. There's maybe this implication that the culture is important and subjectivity is important too. But is there more to, I shouldn't even ask you, is there more to Cushman's argument? There's more to Cushman's argument. And maybe you could say a little bit more.
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the key concepts in Cushman's work, and this runs counter to this idea that there could be some view from nowhere that objective science sort of propagates, it's the concept of thrownness. The idea that when we're born, we are born into a particular cultural terrain that is structured a particular way. It expects certain things of us. There's certain norms that we're born into that we did not choose, and yet we were raised in. And part of the process of human development is to respond to those norms. Now, the extent to which you have choice in that is largely dependent on how oppressive the frame is, let's say, just for one possibility. So, along with this thrownness idea, the idea that at base, the context that shapes our understanding of the lives we live was not a choice for us at the beginning. At the same time, he presents this idea that much of how we view life in our development, if it can change, that's usually an active process. So, along with this idea of thrownness, which sort of speaks to the idea that we don't have much of a say in how we understand our worlds or the context that we're in when we're born, when we're young, that as we age, we're able to explore, to critically examine this context that we're born into, that we're able to question it, that we're able to ask the question, well, is there other ways of doing things? For this, he brings in the metaphor of the cultural clearing or the horizon of understanding. What I like about this metaphor is that visually, like this idea of thrownness, you're plopped into the middle of a horizon. The idea with the horizon of understanding being something that you can explore, that a horizon is movable. These are the sorts of features that suggest that changing your perspective on life tends to be some sort of active process that you need to go about exploring. Well, why do I view things this way? Is it necessary that I view things this way? It also brings to light the idea that there's multiple perspectives, right? Returning to that idea that there's not just one objective view on how to view life. So these are the sorts of philosophical ideas that are underpinning his position. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that, Anthony. He's speaking to this kind of, I don't know if relativism is quite the right word, but I think he is speaking to that there's sort of we're not born into like a reality that operates objectively necessarily. We're born into a cultural frame, and that cultural frame has a particular type of structure to it that affords certain, social and personal and psychological possibilities. And we can't just resituate ourselves entirely from that structure. That structure is like, that's our starting place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we can only sort of move in the directions that the structure allows, right? And so that's where I think the idea of the horizon is a really good one, right? Because it's like there is always a horizon, there's always a place to go, right? But the place that we can go is sort of informed by and structured by where we already are right now. So he's painting a different picture of the human subject, right? Because I don't think that implicit in psychological research or research around psychotherapy is this idea that we are, in a clearing, or even this idea that we're like essentially cultural beings, right? Is kind of this foreign concept. So, right away we're dealing with something quite different from the conventional position in psychology.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe something like narrative therapy picks up on this a little bit more, but for the most part, I think that's absolutely right, that
Yeah.
that cognitive behavioral therapy sometimes is criticized for viewing human subjects as automatons who ultimately act rationally, and that irrationality, so called, is something that needs to be managed.
Right.
And that's not me saying that irrationality rising to the level of, let's say, I mean, delusion is a very heavy word, but
I think that's a nice lead into the idea that every psychotherapy theory sort of has its own attributions for how it is that we suffer or
Yeah.
what accounts for our suffering.
It is
It
a
provides,
particular worldview.
that's right, and it provides sort of a framework for the way that we interpret human suffering.
Indeed.
And it's these frames of interpretation,
Hmm.
like our kind of dominant cultural frame that
It's a
kind of,
belief system, each of
yeah,
these,
Hmm.
and they
yeah.
prescribe certain interventions to relieve what they view is suffering.
And so each posits a certain kind of configuration of the self,
Hmm.
and each also then therefore kind of recommends certain interventions or certain, I guess, things, right,
Hmm.
that a person could do to kind of reconfigure themselves in a particular way.
And so I think that brings us back to, what does Cushman mean by psychotherapy being a cultural artifact? I think he's trying to speak to the influence of American individualism, American consumer capitalism, American colonialism as well. Like all of these things are covered very in depth in his historical analysis. What are the influences of these things, these movements that had been, so dominant and continue to be so dominant in society today? Where is the interweaving of those political, social, and economic forces with how psychotherapy ended up being?
Right. Psychotherapy didn't come from nowhere.
Mm.
Psychotherapy is a product of North American consumer culture, or at least there are many forms. The forms of psychotherapy that we encounter in North America are products of North American consumer culture.
Hmm.
And he's saying that we can't really understand psychotherapy without understanding the cultural history of America, because psychotherapy is a result of, an extension of, a product of the cultural history of North America.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so within that, in the capitalistic worldview, the self could be construed as, well, the ideal self, right, in a capitalist worldview could be considered as a productive person, right? Might as well be a machine, but something productive, a producer that then, yeah, produces things for others, but also consumes,
Hmm.
right? And as soon as you're not either consuming, or as soon as you're either not producing, you are defective. You're out of view of the ideal capitalist individualistic self. And you should be able to kind of do this, on your own in a self-sustaining way, not without a lot of support. This is the sense that I get
Mm.
nowadays.
So yeah, so I love that point, Richard. Yeah, that is the culture that we're dealing with, a culture that's primarily structured around the dynamics of production and consumption. And so there's implications for that about how we understand ourselves, how we understand our psychology, how we relate to other people, and what kind of horizons and opportunities that provides us in terms of personal growth and reconfiguration.
Mm.
And all too often, I think therapy as usual, like let's say certain modalities that are coming or especially close to capitalistic worldviews, then would say we need to get, its mission would be get you producing again.
Right.
And yeah, I think Cushman really challenges this view and offers some other possibilities. Does that move us into a discussion about the different configurations of self that America has formed, or?
I like what you said there around therapy as usual. This idea of therapy as usual tending to focus on helping people to manage their suffering so they can get back to work. This is sort of consistent with Cushman's kind of position and idea that when we're not aware of the cultural frame in which psychotherapy sort of exists and operates from within, then we run the risk of reproducing the configuration of that frame in our relationships, right? And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, and
Colluding with an oppressor, colluding with
yeah,
capitalism,
yeah.
being exactly the thing we don't want to be, certainly not why we would go to graduate school and commit our lives to.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so, I mean, that example of therapy as usual, it's a nice one, right? And we'll get into more maybe about how the particular cultural structure around psychotherapy obfuscates the real conditions of our suffering, and that's partly what allows the reproduction of certain conditions. But
Locates it within the individual.
It has me thinking a lot about what Cushman says about the transition from this sort of Victorian era influenced self going towards the image of the rugged American industrialist, right? Like this idea of the change from the person who is meant to dominate themselves to conform to the one way, the one true way of being in society relative, I mean, to one's class, let's say. There is still some context there. Moving towards this American colonial industrial concept of the person who takes responsibility for themselves. And if something is wrong with them, then if something's wrong in their life, there must be something wrong with them, rather. That is how these sorts of problems would be conceived, which is borrowed, I think, also from this Victorian temperance idea. which I think still holds great influence in politics in North America, and may, through that, still have ripples into how practice can take place if it is done apolitically. In other words, with a tacit or implicit absence of consideration of the frame in which one is practicing.
Yeah, I love Cushman's historical analysis because I feel like it's the first time I've ever read a cultural history of North America that actually tries to identify the real conditions that could structure our suffering,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like prior to this, like, well, I mean, we've all taken psychotherapy theory courses at this point, right? We've been exposed to a lot of different theories. And I think Cushman is right in his analysis that essentially all of those theories do not attribute suffering to the cultural conditions in which we exist at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like suffering as a result of thought errors, or suffering as a result of existential distress or psychological conflicts, developmental conflicts. But there's never been an attribution to sort of like the cultural frame. So Cushman's analysis was so refreshing because, like you just sort of laid out, Anthony, like he starts to talk about the real conditions, the cultural conditions, the lives that people were really living that structured their suffering, right? And it's like, when we look back at, sort of like colonial North America, like it wasn't a great place to live. Like it wasn't an easy time. There was kind of a cultural vacuum in the colonies. A lot of people that were coming into the colonies, they were fleeing religious persecution or poverty or famine or other difficult conditions. And, going to a colony kind of represented their only hope, right? Or at least it represented a possibility. But, in the colonies, they face a sense of emptiness and forlornness and disorientation because they would have uprooted themselves from a particular cultural configuration, cultural structure that was known and familiar to them. And they were in this new space that didn't necessarily afford them the possibilities that their previous configuration did. And so I really liked that idea that Cushman sort of forwarded a lot, which was like, the colonial times was a time of emptiness and chaos and like very difficult, and that hasn't really gone away. Like that
Mm-hmm.
was never something that's really
Yeah.
been addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like we're still living out the consequences of that process and its consequences. And
And they reproduced the very things they were trying to escape, right? They
yeah,
entered the colonies, persecuted, killed,
that's right.
enslaved
Yeah,
indigenous
yeah,
persons.
yeah,
Exactly the conditions that they were trying to escape. You think
for
about
sure.
Irish renters having no rights, the potato
Mm-hmm.
famine, the king taking your crops, all of these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
So very, very interesting. And so we have, thus being so careful that we as therapists recognize all of this history, both present day and past, so we don't reproduce any type of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anthony, I like that. I like the examples you provided in the sense of the sort of Victorian psychology and the temperance movement and stuff, because it speaks to the idea that this isn't new. This idea of sort of developing a way of alleviating the suffering that kind of also obfuscates the conditions which create it.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe every era in human history has suffered from this challenge of, and I know sort of Cushman speaks to it the idea that every era has a particular sort of concept of illness and a particular concept of
Yeah.
healing and a particular concept of the healer. But it seems like that this is always a kind of problem, right? When the basic structure of our culture actually structures our suffering, then its alleviation threatens that configuration. And so there actually needs to be an obfuscation of the real conditions so that the structure doesn't fall apart. I don't know, that might be too big of an argument for right now. I'm wanting to just sort of speak to your point, Anthony, and bring you back into this because I like that you were talking about the Victorian history and just an example of like, yeah, there's been other times and other eras and other examples of like our attempts at understanding suffering and alleviating it without upsetting the cultural frame, like without doing so in a way that actually critiques the cultural frame, which makes it possible.
Mm-hmm. I don't think the idea, Glenn, that you're bringing forward about this obfuscation having a functional and structural purpose within these cultural frames, I think is one that, I don't think we should gloss over.
Ignore,
I don't
yeah.
think we should ignore it. That, yeah, I guess, wouldn't it be
Yeah,
ironic? And
yeah.
so on that topic, I mean, it brings me to thinking about Harry Stack Sullivan's discourse on selective inattention. The idea that when something would overwhelm a dynamic of your life, that if it's easier for your mind to not pay active attention to it, then you'll end up doing that thing. When it enters into the historical analysis, I mean, Cushman, in writing about the genocide of the indigenous people and how that was obfuscated, it was done by offering a configuration of the self to these American pioneers, right, who would become Wild West people, and that's how they were presented in the cultural frame. But in reality, they were soldiers who carried out genocide, right? And that's something that wasn't sold in this technology of the self that was offered, in this configuration of the self that was offered, because to do that would be to acknowledge these acts, these intentional acts, these structural acts of the erasure of a people, of the political function of colonialism being one based in white supremacy. Like, these are the sorts of things that precisely had to be not addressed in these offerings of the configuration of the self. They very well may be in the social and political frame as areas of discourse, but the idea that they would be linked to the configurations that were offered to people had to be obfuscated. Or when it comes to Cushman's analysis of how America and its enslavement of African people was justified in the social frame through similar white supremacist structures, arguments. How in that there was offered for, yet again, usually just like with the frontier men or the men of the Wild West, these configurations were usually offered to people who didn't fit the Victorian frame or the rugged individualist frame. So if you couldn't be, an Anglo-Saxon productive man, but you were a man also still, because, these configurations still weren't offered to women either, then you could become a performer in a minstrel show. And the political function of that would be to erase the oppression, the violence, the cultural violence, the physical violence that was being carried out by America, by the state of America, but, well, not just them either. And it would offer to these people the ability to misrepresent the experience.
I think what we're trying to speak to right now is the idea that colonial North America actually created a certain type of problem, or the cultural conditions in colonial America structured a certain type of problem for people. And the problem was a kind of emptiness and an absence and a loss of identity and a loss of community and culture. And so it structured a problem, right? But the culture also provided a solution, but it had to provide a solution that wouldn't actually interfere with the structure, because the structure also served, like you said, some like structural function, right, or political function, right? Like the structure was important in some way. And so the only types of solutions that can be provided were ones that sort of offset the violence or offset the problem onto someone else. And so
But did it not get in the way of colonizing the West, of producing and manufacturing goods, of building railways?
So it was like we problematize the indigenous people, we problematize Black people, and this allows us to maintain a sense of centrality and a sense of consistency, a sense of purpose.
It's a reduction of cognitive dissonance, right? Oh, here we can provide, you can be this wild cowboy, or you can be this minstrel on stage wearing blackface, in order to reduce this cognitive dissonance that we are really doing something absolutely evil and reproducing the very structures that we were trying to escape.
So I think that's what we're trying to speak of, is sort of like the culture provides solutions to the problem that it creates in a way that sort of offsets the problem but doesn't actually resolve it, because to resolve the problem would be to collapse the entire
Exactly. It doesn't even allow for the questioning of the structure. The structure is an absolute, absolute acceptance of the structure. Oh, you're having difficulty functioning within the structure we prescribe you. Here's some other Band-Aid solutions we can provide you, some other roles you can take.
Yeah. I really like Cushman's sort of analysis of mesmerism. I thought that was a really interesting example of this, of like,
mesmerize us with this.
Well, just like of a particular sort of like cultural solution to this problem that really had no bearing on the conditions. I don't know if I can explain mesmerism as well as Anthony can, but I was sort of interested in like, I'd heard of Mesmer before, but I never actually really read anything on him. But Antoine Mesmer, this like hypnotist, I think he's from somewhere in Europe. and then his philosophy really taking off in North America, and some of the sort of being redeveloped in some ways into that kind of like mind cure philosophy.
Mhm.
And there was this whole like use of electricity and technology and hypnosis and a kind of cognitivism, which I found really interesting. That like Mesmer and Aaron Beck were not so different, but mesmerism really just being this, I don't know, in some ways kind of flaccid solution, like a little bit hokey. And mesmer is often associated with like grifters or hacks, or there's a word I haven't said yet, quackery, right?
Yeah.
Quackery.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this whole mind cure philosophy provided people with a central focus, especially in the absence of religion and sort of like a religious sense of self and spiritual sense of self. Like it gave them a central focus of like how they could try to address their suffering, right? So it
Yeah.
gave them certain types of vehicles for alleviating their suffering, whether
If
that was
only I can think more positively, if only I
yeah,
could get my energies
totally
in balance. And it also provided a role, a very prescribed role for women. Women were allowed to be facilitators of mesmerism and mind cure philosophy, like practitioners, and
hmm
go from town to town when just having a job as a woman outside the home was unheard of.
right,
But again, reproducing the colonial capitalist narrative and certainly not questioning it. So
right, yeah,
With the idea being that through mesmerism and through this mind cure philosophy that you could sort of have like a reset of your mind.
Mm,
And what was this reset for? I mean, it was either yet again to bring you back into normalcy or to allow you to just transcend whatever you're going through. Like no matter how many electric shocks you get around this bathtub with this man that's wearing a fancy hat and a wand, you know, whatever was happening outside of this house, you're different now, and so that doesn't matter. Whatever was going on out there, it's not important. That
hmm
health can
mm,
only really be found in this bounded self
mhm.
that really doesn't have
right,
any meaningful connection to the outside world, in the
Indeed.
sense that your experience of life is fundamentally shaped by what is happening in this relational world that you're embedded
yeah.
within.
But when you're with the guy with the fancy hat in the
Mhm.
bathtub, then you don't have to worry about the outside
I'd
world.
like to be clear, you're in the bathtub, he's dancing around it. Mesmerism, we don't want to get
Indeed.
sued by,
Yeah,
No,
but
mesmers.
the
by the
mesmer,
deceased mesmers.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. That's nicely said, Anthony. Like bringing it back to the notion of individualism, right? Mesmerism had the function of sort of promoting the growing need for individualism, which again is a kind of psychological position or political position that obfuscates the fact that the conditions around us matter. And also this kind of idea of transcendentalism,
Mhm.
like that we can move beyond these conditions, that these conditions are sort of irrelevant. Maybe they do provide some structure, but our true self is sort of somewhere else, or we can lift ourselves from these conditions and experience peace regardless of them.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think I don't want to jump over too many eras in Cushman's analysis, although the three of us here have acknowledged that if we were to go into all of the historical analysis, it might be a
Yeah.
whole series
Yeah.
in the podcast. But this problem of people feeling empty, of people lacking meaning because they're moving towards individualism, which I guess Cushman is arguing is not a sustainable philosophy by itself. So as we move into this individualist way of living in North America, Cushman sort of, I think he's saying that there is a new healing technology that comes out that is the strongest one yet, and it's buying stuff. I mean, buying stuff existed before, but he's saying the field of marketing took on Freud's ideas of the death drive and of the sex drive and converted it into an ability to identify yourself with the products you buy. If you're feeling very crappy about yourself, if you buy a nice car, that will give you a sense of identity relative to the people around you. If you want to set yourself apart from others, the only way that you can do that is by showing it through the products that you buy and that you present to others while you're out in the world. Because if you're an individual and your relationships don't hold bearing on your status in this individualistic society, then there needs to be another avenue.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good, Anthony. Like, I think that what's coming to mind for me is just this interesting idea that because the problem is never really solved, the culture has to constantly reconfigure itself around new solutions, right? Like new temporary solutions. And so it was sort of the idea that okay, when minstrelsy and mesmerism and the frontier were no longer options, like when they were exhausted or they just didn't fit the configuration anymore, what became possible, right? And it's like, okay, then consumerism, as it eventually fit the bill, it became the natural and appropriate solution on the horizon to continue to obfuscate the depleted conditions of our
Mm.
lives, which
Creation of artificial needs, right? And even into, and again, not to skip things, but we can go a bit back and
mhm.
forth
Yeah.
into World War II. There was an excess of factories of rubber, of steel. Okay, what can we make with? We can make more cars. We can
Mhm.
make more appliances, things that meet the most minor of needs. This is how you this is how we do it. I remember even hearing a marketing lecture about even like deodorant, right? Obviously, the idea for like deodorant for us is like, oh yeah, we don't want to smell. But there was just an acceptance in a certain time period, even before the 20s, that okay, people just had their scent. But now we're going to give you this thing that makes you smell, not even just like like reduce your scent, but that you have to smell like this particular like celebrity perfume,
Hmm.
this type of thing. So it brings this quote I just can't get out of my head from Fight Club, one of my favorite movies. We
Mhm.
buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And doesn't that sum up consumerism in a
I
nutshell?
like that a lot. Yeah. But there's certainly like we just have to acknowledge that yeah, we live in a culture of consumerism now. Like consumerism dominates like every facet of our lives, right?
It is our religion. It is our belief
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Our whole cultural frame is structured around consuming, and our identities are based on what we are. Anthony, you have a term for that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I do, but Cushman, he likes to cite Michel Foucault, who labeled this as the empty self with the richly furnished interior. The idea that the essence of who we are at this point that we're discussing, this historical era we're discussing, if you want to feel good inside of you, it better be richly furnished. Now, what does that mean? Like, so the self is already empty because the self is no longer defined through their relation with the world around them, in relation to family, in relation to religion, all of these things. The nuclear family is becoming in vogue. Multi-generational homes are not there anymore. So as we're saying, like what's left is this consumerist impulse, which is justified economically and politically because it needed to happen, to save the American economy. But the idea that if you want to feel good, drink Coke. Ba da ba ba ba. I'm loving it. Like these marketing slogans, their function when you look at them, and I love this game now. Like after reading Cushman, I don't watch ads the same anymore. I wonder, what kind of motivation inside of me are they trying to tease at? This is something that I think Cushman encourages when we say let's look closely at the motivations of how things are constructed around us. But yeah, this is the configuration that Cushman argues exists today. Although he would add that the self is also, in addition to being empty, has become flattened. Now, I think this is in some of his later writings that he talks about this, but the idea that the internet, that these digital doubles we have of ourselves out in the world, on our Facebook profile, on our Tinder profiles, on our Instagram, that the self has become flattened. We need to communicate in photos and in short little posts who we are, and any kind of complexity about how we exist should be removed to keep ourselves simple, to keep ourselves easy to understand. That there is an encouragement in the internet age in particular to let go of nuance.
Yeah, there's sort of a dimensionality that's been lost in the way that we understand ourselves and the way that really we relate to others. Yeah, I really like that, and I think this sort of geometrical analogy is really helpful, right? This idea of space, the space that we can exist in psychologically or culturally, right? And so Cushman's kind of making the argument that, yeah, certain cultural artifacts actually flatten that space. They restrict our space and create less of it, or they even remove a kind of dimension. And so we're not actually operating, by the dynamics that you described, Anthony, we're not actually able to operate in our fullness or in multiple dimensions before, like where there's a kind of reduction. I think we need to come back to psychotherapy now. We need to bring this in. So we're sort of speaking of the cultural sort of background of emptiness. Colonialism created problems that it never really solved, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were other soft solutions forwarded through the culture, and somehow psychotherapy became one of them, right? So, like, not necessarily as an extension of mesmerism, but psychotherapy came into the fold as a way of addressing our problems and alleviating our suffering. And I think Cushman's argument is that psychotherapy itself, similar to these other solutions, has not really been a solution. It has not really come into a position of like really solving the problems that we experience. That in some ways it also reproduces this configuration of the empty self and the dynamics of consumerism.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we talk about Klein? Because that was his
Yeah.
main, Melanie Klein, yeah,
Yeah.
his main piece on that.
Yeah, Glenn, I think this shift to considering Cushman's position on Kleinian relational analysis is really important, and does have this parallel that he's speaking to of flattened subjectivity. Cushman's critique is that the idea of the image of the caregiver, the image of any significant relationship that we have in life, has that experience of flatness. So to speak more to that, it's my understanding through Cushman that in Kleinian relational practice and theory, the idea is that when we're interacting with people, we're really interacting with our mental representation of them in our mind. And that this mental representation has been influenced by all other mental representations that we've had in our life, going all the way back to our primary caregiver. But that the idea of a genuine interaction, genuine communication, is sort of like this barrier that's really difficult to overcome. So Cushman, I think his main critique about this sort of theoretical orientation or theoretical stance is that it doesn't go far enough in considering the cultural context of that person's life. By flattening our primary caregiver, let's say, by flattening their life and experience down to the mental representation of our interactions with them, that doesn't take into account the cultural and historical lived experience context of that person. That if we don't consider the cultural context from which people arise, we're going to have a flattened image of our relationship with them.
Yeah. So I mean that like I like Cushman's critique of object relations theory, just in that idea of it doesn't go far enough. That it's interesting how psychoanalysis simultaneously is like a type of psychotherapy or like a way of approaching human psychology that is very contextual, like in the way that Cushman would sort of advocate for. Like it's and certainly different than other therapies that are acontextual entirely, right? But that it sort of reduces itself to the developmental context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the context of like relations with primary caregivers, but not the cultural context. Like that is still something that's not sort of incorporated into the analysis, right? So everything is sort of reduced to primary experiences with caregivers. There isn't necessarily an attention paid to the cultural background of these experiences. So it's mom, it's dad, but it's not necessarily mother culture or father culture that would be attributed as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was another piece too around consumption, Anthony, like the good breast, the bad breast.
Yeah.
Klein had this whole way of structuring her theory that did kind of resemble dynamics of consumption, and that's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting too.
And that's why Cushman argues that Kleinian object relations was chosen over, say, the interpersonal school of Harry Stack Sullivan, Eric Fromm, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, that Karen Horney, that these theoreticians who wanted to contextualize their work, who wanted to recognize what was irreducible, that these theoreticians could not have become, as influential as Kleinian object relations, because the economic consequences of that would be too high.
right? Ultimately, Klein reduced human psychology to the notions of taking in an experience,
Mm-hmm.
consuming it, or spitting it out,
Mm-hmm.
through her theory of incorporation
Mm-hmm.
and rejection. And these other theorists, you're saying, like the contextualists, they would have posed too great a challenge to the sort of the conventional configuration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I really enjoyed Cushman's analysis of sort of the history of psychoanalysis, and that's sort of his space. And so he picked on Klein a little bit, and he picked on Kohut, and sort of how these theoreticians, they offered something really significant in the development of psychoanalytic theory, like certainly not something to be dismissed
Mm-hmm.
outright, but that he's just sort of pointing out that somehow their theory remained consistent with the configuration of self as consumer, and that's what made them attractive, right? And so, he's coming back to his central thesis, which is that psychotherapy poses the possibility of reproducing this cultural configuration, right? It sort of keeps like it, our culture sort of structures the problem, and our psychotherapy kind of maintains it rather than resolving it, right? by
Mm-hmm.
by sort of reinforcing the general position. And so even in psychoanalysis, like this sort of way of being, which is kind of radical, this way of approaching psychotherapy, which is kind of radical, he's saying that there's still this sort of this dynamic implicit, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I'm kind of sad, and this is maybe where we would move into our own analysis now, because I'm kind of sad that Cushman didn't extend his analysis to other forms of psychotherapy. But I'm certain that there's configurations of the self in other non-analytic forms of psychotherapy that are equally problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we would go into that now, of talking about other types of configurations of the self, other ways of practicing psychotherapy, and how they structure the self, and they do it in a way which really deviates from this sort of the dominant cultural structure of consumer capitalism, or do they also kind of inadvertently, in their own way, reproduce that configuration, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, just like off the top of my head, the first thing I can think about is I feel like Richard and I have talked about this before. We've critiqued this notion before of kind of psychotherapy as a commodity, like the
Mm-hmm.
commodification of psychotherapy, are sort of like heading into manualizing,
Mm-hmm.
like the increasing technification of psychotherapy, the sort of popularization of psychotherapy concepts on social media, coaching, like the whole thing. Like there's this whole industry that's blown up around, and it does seem like one of the trends in psychotherapy is just to make it a product which can be sold and marketed and
Mm-hmm.
consumed by other people. Yeah.
Well, and a lot of those main points are actually exactly the topics of the chapters of Cushman's second book, Travels with the Self. So he did
Oh,
end up
gee.
following up on this in the 20 years after constructing the self, constructing America. He might be one of the first psychoanalysts to really talk about the internet in a meaningful way. But yes, this idea of the McDonald'sification of psychotherapy, like I'll have a number one with cognitive distortion, reconfiguration, all this stuff, like the idea
Well,
that
just sort of speak to experience around that. I'm just thinking about, like, it's been a theme across my sort of ongoing experience in the field of grappling with sort of who I am in relation to the person that I'm supporting,
mm-hmm,
and kind of dealing with this dynamic sometimes of them sort of asking me to offer them a product, right? Like
mm-hmm,
to yeah, that how they like, and it's not their fault. It's just like that's the culture around psychotherapy. It's how they understand themselves, and so they're looking for something to take in, right?
mm-hmm,
And that poses an immediate challenge of, okay, well, how do I like respect that, but also not engage in a way where I'm reproducing the dynamic of consumerism within our space. It's very difficult to talk about what psychotherapy is when we don't think about it in terms of I guess, the kind of conventional ways we think about it, either in terms of mental illness and its alleviation, or in terms of sort of solutions, or the idea of sort of betterment or getting better. Like when we really critique and deconstruct that frame and try to step away from it, it becomes very difficult to talk about what psychotherapy can do then, right? Because if I say, okay, well, this person can get better, there's a huge implication that they're not good right now,
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
that something of the psychotherapy will make them better, right? It
mm-hmm,
will improve them,
And
right?
what is better?
Yeah, exactly,
mm-hmm,
exactly, right? Yeah, that runs the risk of reconfiguring a certain cultural arrangement, right? That reconfigures the sense of emptiness or absence in the person, right? They don't have something they need to be filled, right?
Hmm.
So we can't talk about it in terms of betterness, but then it's like, what are we talking about then, right? And so I always find myself struggling to think about, okay, well, what would be the solutions or the end, not even solutions, the ends that psychotherapy would take us to when we don't follow this pathway,
And in
right?
another way of putting that, as we've
Yeah.
mentioned in previous episodes, if not symptom reduction,
Yeah.
then we acknowledge the pro symptom position. But what does that look like? And what does that look like in the
Yeah.
modern context? How can that be done? Often, when I'm describing that or trying to educate other practitioners or talk about this in supervision, it's so difficult, right?
Right. Right.
And I do want to bring up the concept of capitalist realism. Of course, it's difficult to think about alternative ways of living, alternative ways of producing, consuming, contributing, alternative ways of therapy outside of bread and butter CBT uh, ways, because in capitalist realism, capitalism becomes the only system that can exist, right? And it becomes this idea that it's impossible to have democracy without capitalism, which, by the way, is not. Yeah, so it becomes this system that cannot be attacked, and it really is a religious
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sacrilege to attack the system, right? And I will literally see people become quite angry. They're like, well, okay, if not this, right? Like, this is even supervisees or students, and even actually very experienced therapists as well that have been practicing for many years. Well, if I'm not practicing this, what possibly could that look like, right? And my
Mhm.
patients are coming to me for the relief of suffering. You're telling me I can't relieve, you know, their suffering,
Right.
which right
Right.
there again, saying that I can relieve somebody else's suffering, there might be some arrogance, unintentionally, that is inherent in that position as well. But we see the nature of how complex this is.
Yeah, yeah. There's a certain relational configuration we always seem to go back to, and that's the person is empty and in need of something, and we're meant to provide it.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Somehow,
that's right.
the relational process of psychotherapy becomes a consumptive one, even if we don't intend to, and even if that is actually the problem in some ways. The emptiness is the problem. What would it mean if we actually talked about
Bingo.
the emptiness, right? Yeah, and looked at the context in which that emptiness came from. Yeah.
Hmm.
Very well said. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Richard, I wanted to piggyback off of the comment you made about the pro symptom position, because I think that is a kind of way that we can approach this work. It's sort of a nice way that we've talked about before, that provides an example of how we can approach the work that in a way that doesn't reconfigure the arrangement, right? Because when we take the pro symptom as opposed to the anti symptom position, then we're sort of suggesting that the symptom matters, that it has a function, right? And that inevitably leads us to the context in which the symptom is necessary, right? And so now, rather than reconfiguring this notion that the self is in some ways deficient and needs a filling, right, or needs something to consume, we're sort of acknowledging the emptiness, right? We're actually trying to get at the reality of the emptiness. That's what we're trying to do. We're taking the emptiness as real, so we're not seeing it as something to be filled, but rather something meaningful, some meaningful representation of the person's real suffering. So yeah, that's a good example.
I'm hearing, what does the symptom have to say? What does the
Yeah.
symptom let us know?
Yes.
And what is it trying to express that might be able to be re-expressed in a different way that might be more
That's right.
suitable for the person?
That's right.
I
That's
mean,
right. Yeah.
it's very much just a reconfiguration of the Freudian concept of sublimation in a lot of ways.
Well, in a way, I think it goes a little bit beyond that,
Hmm.
in the sense that it's, if you really follow the symptom through a process, then I think it leads to a reconfiguration of the self, right? But certainly sublimation is one way of attending to a symptom. If we take at least the reality seriously and we recognize what the symptom is doing,
Hmm.
then we can start to be in a position to kind of renegotiate how we, renegotiate the function, or how we meet that need, or how we express that function, right?
Yeah, it does go beyond sublimation, because sublimation is still this idea that we, whether create art or building or
Yeah.
other ways, right, that are functioning within the existing societal structures.
Mm.
But a pro-symptom position is very radical, because it goes to the point that
Yeah.
we may actually be protesting against the structures of the system itself.
Mm.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if we take the example, for instance, of minstrelsy,
Hmm.
we could see that as a symptom, right? And so, as deplorable as it is, as deplorable as the racism that it expresses is, right? We could also see it as a symptom of a certain kind of emptiness. It's speaking to the fact that this culture provided so little for people that they had to go out of their way to, and oppressing isn't the right word, but deprecating, a whole group of people, right?
Hmm.
Just to feel better about themselves, just to experience some type of cultural sustenance, right?
Hmm.
So the symptom speaks to the reality. It speaks to the reality that we're embedded in. So yeah, so all that to say, just I think it's a lovely way of sort of coming back into, or a lovely way of approaching how we might reconfigure things. But yeah, I wanted to say one more thing, and that's, or several more things, and that's just around, okay. And so, but if we take seriously the idea that the general frame, the sort of therapy as is, tends to lead us back to this configuration of the self where the person is empty and in need of filling, then we could look at the way that other therapies frame what they do and see similar dynamics, right? So we can see in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's the irrational self in need of rationalization,
Hmm.
right? There's sort of this popular notion of trauma, in our contemporary era. So we can see the traumatized self in need of healing, right? We can see the oppressed self in need of liberation. That's a sort of popular frame now, right? I know, like in AEDP and EFIT and some of these more popular sort of like relational psychodynamic therapies, there's sometimes this notion of like the sort of isolated self in need of intimacy, or there's a sort of notion of like intimacy as a solution, right? Like in relationship as a solution, like I can offer you relationship. I think that's how it's interpreted, is like the person is deficient in connection, they're deficient in healthy relating, and so here attachment, right? And so here's an opportunity to sort of provide or foster a certain relationship. But I think each of these falls along the dynamics of like the person is deficient in some ways and need of filling,
Hmm.
and they don't quite speak to the deficiency, right? They just try to provide a vehicle or a solution that doesn't quite get to the context in which that. Yeah.
In a sense, it's like, for $200 an hour, let's meet the need, that was unmet
Hmm.
by your parents.
Well put.
The
Well put.
needs of all of the rest of society and what it means to be a person, and dealing with emptiness within the self and inequity and injustice within society.
Mm.
That's not brought up so much.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. The context. Like when someone is, what would be an example? Like when someone's narcissistic, right? They have a narcissistic presentation, or some people will see this as, okay, well, the way that I need to support them then is to provide a sort of like healthy deflationary experience. We need to try to rein in the narcissism, right? Like they're too big. I need to help them to be smaller, or I need to help them contact reality or something like that, right? But another way of looking at this would be, what is the context that makes their narcissism necessary, right? How is it that they've come to be narcissistic? What drives that, right? And what function does it serve? So I mean, we've talked about this before. We know this is sort of the frame that we approach things, right? Is symptoms as solutions. But yeah, I think that's the alternative way, which I think is the therapy is as is way, is, okay, what kind of intervention can I provide that somehow works against this narcissism or this symptom or whatever, or somehow brings it cessation, right? But I think what we're leading into now is that Cushman himself sort of advocates for a certain type of position, a certain way of approaching psychotherapy.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, why don't we speak to that?
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is this idea of a three-person psychology. What Cushman means by this is, if Freudian psychoanalysis or CBT is a one-person psychology where the practitioner is a blank screen who can't be conceptualized as having any impact of their self on the client without it being a failure of the therapy, and let's say object relations or a lot of relational practices, a two-person psychology that focuses on the relationship in the room. A three-person psychology permits a consideration of the context outside of the therapy room, not as being a distraction, but rather the fact of the matter is the majority of the client's life is going to be lived outside of this therapy room. And one way that Cushman puts it is, when the client is speaking to a conflict that is occurring out in the real world. Cushman doesn't want the intervention to be limited to the therapy room. He wants to encourage the client to through reflection, through consideration of the clearing in which they reside, and what has or has not been looked at, what can they do to go back out into the world and engage with their surroundings or otherwise change them in a way that brings resolution there in the daily life and the lived experience of that person, is one way that Cushman offers a reconfiguration of therapeutic practice. Instead of the clinician having some expert role of providing to the client exactly what they needed, just offering an open enough space to ask, well, what are some ways of responding to the context in which we live that might be better for this person? But that's a
Right.
collaborative process that can only
In a
really come about.
sense,
Yeah.
is that the statement the personal is political? Does it relate to this statement? I know Cushman
Yeah.
didn't say that.
Yeah, I think absolutely it does. Or it can anyway, right? Like when a client is dealing with issues of marginalization, let's say, like the discourse around both the social and psychological aspects of that person's life will be considered concurrently. And if there are political things that are occurring in that person's life that are important, well then maybe it's important for the practitioner to have some sort of structure for engaging with that instead of dismissing it as not being in the room, because your door, when it closes, it does not leave the rest of the world out. Just as there's no view from nowhere, there not like if a client comes in and they're dealing with problems in life that are based in social, economic, or political circumstances, to pretend that, oh well, we can, the only thing I can do for you is what you contribute to this, well then that's a non-starter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because we can't recapitulate the individualism that obfuscates the way people really are. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love that, this idea that we have to see people as situated in culture, and we have to see their experience as culturally mediated. He gave a good case example of this. It revolves more around the concept of intersectionality, which he brought in. But I feel like it would be a good way of concretizing this. I'm thinking about the case example of like the woman that he spoke about, who grew up in a very patriarchal culture, and I can't remember if she was like maybe physically abused by a parent, but there was like a strict patriarchy in her sort of culture of origin. And one of the functions of this patriarchy was like she psychologically felt she maintained a sense of closeness unconsciously with her father through her meekness or her dependence or her compliant nature, right? And so this sort of sense of compliance that she held was an important part of her psychological life, especially as a young person, and it had a number of different dynamic functions, right? But then she moved and was sort of resituated in a different culture, and the culture was sort of predominantly feminist, right? Or there were at least cultural opportunities of feminism that presented themselves to her, and this was appealing to her for a number of reasons, in the ways that feminism often is for women, right? It affords like so many opportunities and configurations of the self that a patriarchy doesn't. And so she began to explore and take an interest in and incorporate elements of feminism into her life. But there was sort of an intersectionality of these two worlds, right? And it wasn't so simple. And so I think the nice thing about this example is that it highlights different ways of interpreting the problem, right? And one is to interpret it more from like a two-person psychology, like a more like traditional psychoanalytic view, to reduce her problems, or to configure her problems or interpret her problems through the language of developmental relationships. But the other sort of brings in a cultural element which like informs her experience. To me, the case example was interesting because there was sort of a respect and appreciation for both worlds, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was sort of a respect and appreciation for the fact that like the early dynamics had their bearing, they had their power, like they were not something that could just be eliminated. They spoke to a certain type of context that was very important, like developmentally important, right?
Mm-hmm.
and situated her in a particular way. But equally important were the possibilities that came with feminism, and it was conflicting for her. I think that that's what it he spoke to, was this idea that it was conflicting for her, how to be, right, how to be,
Mm-hmm.
and how to configure herself, right. So that, again, that's more in line with the notion of intersectionality, though, the idea that there's multiple contexts in our life that intersect all the time. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So maybe we want to scrap that. I don't
No,
know
no,
if I
no.
spoke
Glenn, I think you're speaking to something here that Cushman brings up quite a bit, which is the reproduction of old horizons and old ways of
Mhm,
being.
mhm,
That
mhm,
that what Cushman keeps from two-person relational theory is the idea that, and I mean, even in one-person psychology, the idea that the circumstances in which we're raised, that we become acclimated to, that we're socialized within, become familiar, and this familiarity allows us to feel comfortable in that way of being, even if it limits our agency, even if it harms
mhm,
us. that
mhm,
that there's this pull towards this sense of familiarity because at least it's structured, at least we know what's
mhm,
coming in this configuration of life. Whereas when we're offered a new way of being that is unfamiliar, this sense of the unknown, the sense of not having yet the support that is afforded from this new way of living, that can be scary. I mean, maybe even we're talking about. I think this still might even tie into this pro versus anti-symptom view, where if we're trying to remove symptoms, like what are we giving to? Well, I'm maybe still using this consumerist metaphor. Isn't that funny? I can't even talk about this anti-symptom view without talking about what's being given otherwise. But if the goal is symptom reduction, and that symptom was something that allowed the client to process or grieve, then when we take the symptom away, what's going to come up next? As it relates to
yeah.
the reproduction of old horizons, though, in that case study, I hear, there's the fact of how our lived experience has brought us to the point we are in the
Mhm,
metaphor of thoroughness and the metaphor of the horizon of understanding. One thing that I think Cushman tries to offer as a practice, as an implication of these metaphors, is therapy as the illumination of the horizon. That intentionality, active reflection, and consideration of what we want in our lives, what we believe is in accordance with our values and our morals, that this can be the stuff of therapy.
mhm,
And it involves sometimes, valuations of what was not provided in the old horizon, despite its
mhm,
familiarity. Because if we don't do that reflection, then we know it can be a tendency for people to resort to old ways of being. And that this isn't evidence necessarily that there's something corrupt or wrong with the person in front of us. Rather, that if somebody doesn't have a pathway before them that they can understand. I mean, this speaks to things like expectancy effects in efficacy
mhm,
studies of therapy, right? Like when
mhm.
someone has an understanding of the path that they intend to walk down, it's easier to walk down it.
Yeah. But I think also what you're speaking to, though, in the notion of illumination, though, is like when we're actually able to identify and talk about the real context of our suffering,
Hmm.
when we're actually able to see that for what it is,
Hmm.
then horizons naturally materialize. That's my sense of it, at least. I don't
Yeah.
know if he ever said that, but
Yeah.
I think he's saying that the process of moving through the horizons only comes when we have a clear sense of where we are now, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and where we've been. Yeah. Yeah, and so that's necessary. That's essential. We have to be able to talk about well, maybe not every, but like we have to be able to talk about the relevant contexts that inform our experience, and
Hmm.
those have to be brought into the room, or else we'll be leaving something obfuscated, and we won't be able to move past it then, right? Because we won't have a clear sense of the horizons that it provides that we can move to.
Hmm. Yeah. So a couple years ago, and this is just my personal life. This isn't in professional work. I was walking back home. I was living in the downtown east side at the time, and on my way home around 11 p.m., I noticed something around Great Northern Way and Main Street for all of our listeners in Vancouver, if you happen to be there, where there was a man with a cane who seemed to be yelling, shaking his cane at this guy who was just sort of crouched down on the curb. And I thought it was curious, so I decided to walk by. I'd been trained in de-escalation. It seemed like maybe a situation which needed de-escalation. As I walked by, I heard the man with the cane yelling at the person sitting on the curb, saying, get up right now. You just have to fucking get up and stop doing drugs. He said it like that, with that voice. And the person on the curb was just despondent, right? Not responding, deflated. So the other person towering over them, holding a cane, threatening to make him get up. I was like, okay, you know what? Like, I'm gonna sit down next to this guy, sitting on the curb. I turned over to him and I whispered, "Hey, it seems like this person's being pretty aggressive towards you, eh?" He said, "Yeah." I hear from the person with the cane. He says, "What did you say?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just walking by. I overheard some things, and I just felt like I had to ask him. Like, seems like you are being pretty aggressive towards him, eh?" The guy with the cane replies, "Well, that's just how you have to be, right?" And my understanding of the situation at the time, it seemed like this person, they said that they had their own experiences with addiction as they were yelling at the guy sitting on the curb. I said, you say that's how you have to be. And I recognize maybe you're speaking from your own personal experience where that worked for you. But I have to say, as somebody from the outside, it doesn't look like it's having a beneficial effect in this situation. So I encouraged this man with the cane to walk away, which he did. And I said I would take it over from there if the goal was to try and provide some support to this person who's sitting alone on the street where it's cold and looking pretty sad. So I end up talking to this person. He thanked me for getting this guy to go away. And I said, "Hey, it is what it is. It's all right. Aside from that, how's the rest of your night been?" And he's like, "Oh shit, it was check day the day before. He'd lost his money, his supply of heroin." And in talking to him, he ended up saying things like, "This isn't how I used to be." And I said, "Oh, like what did you used to be like? What was that like?" He said, "I used to like things. I used to be connected with my family. I used to play guitar." We got to chatting about that sort of stuff. And he was telling me about this old way that he used to be. And then at some point, the conversation turned, and unprompted, he asked, "So, hey, do you think it's possible for someone who does heroin to have a life afterwards?" Now, this question, like, it hit me very hard, because what a heavy question for somebody to be asking. It implies a high level of risk for somebody to not see a future. But such an interesting question too, because he's essentially asking if someone like him is allowed in the frame of society. If we're putting this into the context of the conversation we're having now. I said, "You know what? Yeah, like I've seen plenty of people who've used heroin have life afterwards in so many different ways. This person who was wagging his cane seemed to think that there was only one way to do so." And I said, "You know what? I understand that that's how he might have needed to think, but I'm very sorry that the way he's interacted with you has maybe contributed to this question." I mean, I didn't say that to him literally, but that's essentially the sentiment. So we continue talking, and eventually he does the little bit of residue that's left in his pipe as I'm sitting there with him, and he's nodding off a little bit. And then he asked me, yet again unprompted, if I had a flashlight. I said no, and that I'm sorry. I wish I could have bought him a flashlight. I hadn't been paid yet for a couple weeks. I was very poor, so I was like, I would happily, buy you a flashlight if I could, but I'm afraid I don't have the money. And a couple minutes later, he asked me again, but he said, "So do you have a flashlight?" Now, at this moment, in my mind, I'm thinking like, what the heck? Like, what does this mean? Like, is he just high? And so he's asking me this question again because he didn't remember asking me the first time. Maybe that's possible. In the moment, I didn't think he was literally asking me for a flashlight anymore. I I thought he had heard me try and speak to, it is possible to have life after heroin. Maybe a flashlight with this topic of illumination. Maybe he's just asking like, how is that possible? So we continued talking, and I asked him about his music. His face had lit up when he was talking about how he used to be in a band, he used to play guitar, all of these things. So I asked him, like, what sort of music did you play? And his face lights up again. There's this energy that's coming in. where previously he had been nodding off and very despondent and there was this energy that came back into his voice. And as we were talking, eventually I said to him, so like, I wonder if there's a place where you could just play guitar sometime, like a community center or something, or if it's possible to get a guitar again. He's like, yeah, you know what? I've really been wanting to do that. I think there's something enticing about not just the reproduction of old horizons, being a tendency for slipping back into a place where you have less agency. It also allows people, I think, to consider that they have been places where they have more agency sometimes. That sometimes to find a path from a situation where it feels very dark, you can try and, for a moment, look at a broader horizon that includes a past self where you might have been happy, or all these things, and trying to experience in your body what it felt like to be in that moment. Yeah. No, sorry. I know that's a long story, and I hope it was still something that sort of communicates the significance, at least for me, in how I think about things, about the illumination of the horizon of understanding, especially because I think, like when it comes with substance use or other issues like that, people's horizons become restricted. It becomes harder to see outside of one's experience at the horizon around them. It becomes harder to conceptualize of where someone is meant to fit in their social world. So that's sort of this interaction that I've had with this person, what that has come to mean to me.
Hmm. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that example, Anthony. I think it's a really, really beautiful example. There's such a stark contrast between the man with the cane
Hmm.
and his conceptualization of this person, even seeing them as a marginalized self or a self that needs violence, right?
Hmm.
That violence is sort of essential. It speaks to that, the particular clearing of that person's life and the situation they stand into. But it does speak to a sort of cultural conception of people who struggle with addictions as in need of a strong hand, right? Or
Hmm.
it was a nice way of sort of illustrating, like, the way that we conceptualize or interpret addiction and the possibilities that afford, right? And there is still, I think, a strong attitude in our culture towards addiction that it's something that needs or sort of demands oppression and limits and warrants a power imbalance. Yeah, and I'm just thinking about how, that particular configuration affords so little, right? Like when a person is told that they're bad and that, for having an addiction, like what possibilities do they have in front of them and in terms of reconfiguring that, right?
Hmm.
And I think the way that you engage with him just it opened doors, it provided opportunities to reconsider what his addiction actually is, or what, who he is, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And like possibilities came from that. I loved the flashlight piece. I thought that was so beautiful.
It was a wild interaction. I mean, for somebody to ask you, is it possible to have life after heroin? I mean, implicit in the conversation I had with this person up to that point, like when I was responding to the person with the cane, I said, I have experience with addiction too, but it doesn't mean that this is the only way to do it. So
Mhm.
this person that I'd been talking to already knew I had some kind of lived experience. So there was a vulnerability in asking that. It's rare that I think people, like, that's a really existential question. And
Yeah.
what's sad is the answer is yes, and the reconfiguration needs to happen at both the individual and the social level. Because as long, like, later in that conversation, before I said goodbye, I have to, go make dinner and all that stuff. He said, I remember right before I left, he said that me getting that guy with the cane to go away was one of the nicest things that had ever happened to him, and that no one else has ever stood up for him before. And I responded, like, thank you, that's very nice of you to say, but I have to also say it makes me very sad to think that no one else has ever stood up for you before. I hope I'm not the last person, because one isolated act is not sufficient, sadly, and that's what sort of becomes sad. Like, that's why implicit in Cushman's framework is supporting active decision making. That the context that we live in, where we may be thrown into them, but we do have some kind of agency in reconstructing at least the space around us, in how we interact with the world, in what we give energy to. And that maybe the cruelest aspect of consumer capitalism is that it encourages passive living,
Apathy.
apathy.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying in some ways, Anthony, is like the culture produced this for this man, really, right?
Yeah.
And the culture has also constrained and limited the options available to him. And it's sort of in some ways only when the culture changes that he can change, or at least if the culture changed, he could change as well, right? There are a few doors for him right now. There are a
Mhm.
few opportunities, yeah, a few pathways, narrow horizons.
Yeah. So illumination isn't always, the end all and be all. You can't just work
Yeah.
with reflection, because sometimes it's the case that the situation that people are in is not their fault, and that at this point where they are, they may need a shift in horizon. Like they may actually need to be, put in touch with supports that actually change their situation. Just as the child that's put into a home that is neglectful and physically abusive or sexually abusive or whatever like that. They did
Mhm.
not choose those situations. And yeah, sorry. No,
Yeah, yeah,
it's more
no.
complicated.
It is. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, it is. But yeah, it speaks to the idea that when we change the terrain in which we live, then we change the possibilities that we have, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's great if and when those supports can recognize that, the drug use is just a symptom,
Hmm.
that you get to the core pain, the trauma, the
Mhm.
intersectionality of the cultural
Hmm.
oppression that may have been happening. It is very hard to live in our capitalist society, right? It's
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
expensive. 9 to 5 jobs when you have any type of disability, it's extremely difficult.
Mhm.
Often people are having in jobs where actually they're living to survive, but every day they actually are getting deeper in debt. So
Mhm.
it's I just want to acknowledge like that is a huge contributor, right? Because heroin is in particular, I think about the opioids and their ability to disconnect us from self, but
Mhm.
disconnect us from pain
Yep.
as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
As of course they make sense for this person
Mhm.
as a, the solution that, he feels is kind of the only thing available to him. There is limited solutions that we create, and there's a lot of hoops to jump through and expectations to be met in the capitalist configuration of self, right? If he's not going to be a productive worker,
Mhm.
it's not so easy. Even, your suggestion, great, go to community center. Are they going to let this person in to the
Yeah.
community center? Let him play a guitar. Like, these are the things that I think about on a really practical level.
Yeah.
So,
In
like,
East Vancouver maybe, but
in East
in
Vancouver,
in
yeah,
Burnaby maybe not, right? Like
yeah,
or
exactly,
like
exactly. So the location of that,
or the
right? And you
West
can
End or
think
wherever. Yeah.
about, yeah, supports like Vancouver area network of drug users,
Yeah.
like places that are actually, this is the experience of these people, the phenomenological experience. They are banding together. They're getting support from legal teams, from other elements of society
Mhm.
to address this is what our experience is, whether the greater society would like to hear it or not. We are going to state unapologetically our experience and what factors of oppression are occurring.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'll speak to another. I'll speak to a clinical example just briefly, just to sort of kind of expand upon what's already now I think a very wide horizon in terms of broadening our approach to psychotherapy. Yeah, the example that I'll speak to, I'm just thinking about how in the summer I started working with a patient, and the patient, well, I mean, obviously they're diagnosed with cancer, so that's a part of their context. Started to explore, I guess, their vulnerabilities and what kind of brought them to counseling. They needed support, and their primary concern or understanding of what they needed support with was adult ADHD. Adult ADHD was a way of signifying their struggles and their suffering, and what they found difficult about life. And they identified it as a vulnerability in the context of having cancer, because in addition to the adult ADHD, which was already making life difficult, now they also had a cancer diagnosis on top of this, and so it's really the way I engaged around the notion of adult ADHD, which I think is emblematic of an approach kind of consistent with Cushman's, because what I found interesting right away was I felt like the concept of ADHD was actually very limiting
Mhm.
in terms of what kind of avenues it provided for this person to explore their difficulties, because the diagnosis was sort of a canned explanation for how they suffered. And it was an example of essentialism, which was a concept we wanted to bring into this discussion. So I'm glad I can provide an example of this. Like, it was an example of a way of interpreting or attributing one's problems to kind of something inbuilt within themselves, right? Something that's aconditional. Like, there's nothing else that we can sort of like relate to this thing. It just sort of is a thing, and it, has a life and exists and is a factor, but it's horizonless. Maybe
Mhm.
that's one way of looking at something that's essential, is that it's sort of horizon. It's something that can't be explored or interrogated or understood, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, the right away there was this feeling that even though, the concept of ADHD, can be a helpful one, and certainly having worked with this person for some time now, I think it does fit their experience. Like, just working within the frame of I have ADHD was kind of like a stultifying and narrow place. And I found it difficult to sort of know how to explore this person. I guess there was a sense of the term ADHD sort of led us back to a known and familiar place. Yeah, like, and so essentially what I had to do was I had to start to try to engage with this person in a way where we could try to interrogate something, or explore, maybe is a better word, something of their experience. And so I kind of used more of a narrative
Mm.
approach with this person, using their existing language, and trying to understand more about the context of their life,
Mhm.
more about who they were and the sort of the train of their life, and what variables or what factors or what the context was that might inform their suffering. Because again, ADHD as a signifier was not really revelatory. It didn't really provide me with much information about their experience. And so we engaged in this process over a couple of sessions. And it was interesting because first we worked with the language of sort of like panic mode. Yeah, let's go with panic
Mm.
mode. I think it might have been emergency mode, but panic mode. And the person sort of talked about how they've been in panic mode for a long time now, and that's sort of the way that they operate. And so then panic mode gave me an opportunity to start to explore, okay, well, where does that come from? What does that mean, right? Tell me more about panic mode. And so panic mode was sort of a way of being that involved only ever attending to, the essential tasks, right? In panic mode, there was no opportunity for sort of creativity. There was no opportunity for relaxed living. Panic mode was basically like, I just do all day, and I do as much as I can, and there's always too much. So like part of it was like panic mode from it came from a place of being overwhelmed, and then we started talking about more about overwhelmed. Okay, so how was it that panic mode became essential? When did this overwhelming start? And so there was a nice sort of exploration of the context, and this led to a discussion of the person's divorce and their experience as a single parent. And I'm sure we could have gone further. The process that we were in sort of demanded a shift to practical considerations, because that part of my job is I help people in also sort of like a social work fashion. So we've gone in that direction. I think that's fine and completely suitable for the patient. But I want to just provide that as a case example of sort of like the space that ADHD provided was very narrow. So I didn't
Mhm.
feel like I had much to work with this person when all we were talking about was sort of their ADHD. And I think that their ADHD, it sort of reproduced a particular configuration that was actually kind of dissatisfying to them, because it's sort of funny how they would talk about other professionals that they had worked with, and it seems like they never really came to an outcome that they were hoping for. Like, ADHD remained a problem in their life that hadn't really resolved, right? And
Mm.
our discussion did lead to the notion of like, there are different ways of approaching therapy. Therapy doesn't have to just be being diagnosed and being given a set of interventions to sort of address that diagnosis. Therapy can be a process where, we look at things, or where we grieve. And that was one that sort of came up around the divorce, right? Like, maybe there's unfelt feelings there that,
Mm.
that don't have a life, right? And I'm sure there was more, because we only spent a few sessions doing this, and the horizons could have expanded for a long time. But yeah, I think it's just an example of trying to work in a way where I widened the relational and the psychological space to one where there was more of an understanding of the context of the person's life, and then therefore sort of more opportunity to look at what that context might afford.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that, Glenn. Yeah.
Yeah, no
Yes.
problem.
I can share a brief example.
Sure.
So Working in Vancouver, very diverse population that I work with. Often clients are coming to me because I do specialize, I guess, in trauma therapy very often. Um, they're coming in and they're talking about obviously their family, their parents, and I'm thinking about certain BIPOC clients I have. Either coming from war-torn areas of the Middle East, or may have a background of looking many generations back into slavery and other oppression, right? So those are things; those are part of the cultural space and context. But those things, it's very interesting. Like, it's interesting being a white therapist because I'm often the first to acknowledge those. Now, I think in the past, both the client and myself might not have acknowledged that, and I'm carrying out the scientific technology of therapy robot, and providing some maybe some mindfulness CBT skills, and the kind of, and then maybe beyond that, okay, some EMDR, some things like this, and then kind of that's it. But now our discussions very much include, oh, this is perhaps the person has like an internalized oppressor, right? An internalized critic. I can think about this, and I was talking with one client, this idea of this whipping, right? Whipping of the back, right? And this, it's a very strong image, but he was talking about how his parents, and raised in like a single parent family, these women that needed to be really strong, and that they were strong, and you needed to be entrepreneurial, and you just needed to kind of buck up, and you just needed to kind of get through, and that this has served him in many ways, but also in other ways that this, now an internalized voice. But we explored further, well, where does this come from, even for them? And going back into the history of slavery, right? Like, this is these certain things that their beliefs that they have. These beliefs didn't come from nowhere. They came from, in order to survive and with limited choices. This is the only configuration of self, or the way of knowing and living. And it's because for him it was being perfect all the time. Again, if I make a mistake, I'm a horrible person. And so we were trying to explore other possibilities of living. What is it like to be a person who can explore and learn and make mistakes? And this touching on of the the intergenerational trauma of the past, but that it's still alive today, right? Slavery is banned, but Black men, for example, they're attending therapy at a much lower rate. Therapy is not a safe space, and therapy, of course, has colluded with really nasty, dehumanizing, like or psychology, let's say, assessment practices, right? To show, oh, this is a reason why we can support these oppressive practices, even in the 1900s, even not that long ago, and keeping people segregated and stuff, because the Black person is going to kind of be the rotten apple that will spoil the bunch, and won't be able to understand the education if they're integrated into education. So there's all of these ideas that are really both the recent past, and still though have these echoes into today. And I can also think, finally, like with many clients I have from the Middle East, escaping Afghanistan, Syria, etc. They're exploring the abuse that may have happened to them from their parents. But we also have to really look at, well, you had a government and military that were showing up at the door and saying, like, force eviction from your home by gunpoint. Some of these things you may not remember, or maybe not have even happened to you as a child, but they happen to your parents, and your parents are reproducing this. This is the context that, if we don't acknowledge that, and acknowledge that these things are still happen, and they're in a sense lucky enough, and there was enough maybe they were also in a better social caste, so to speak, to be able to get out, like a higher socioeconomic class, that there were so many people that are left behind and still in that. So those possibilities become of having a different living are just so much more limited. And I think it helped some clients understand and like reduce some of the blame towards themselves, and accurately, put blame towards society structure, and even see their parents and themselves as more human.
I love that example, Richard. Thanks for sharing that.
Kind of a meta example, but that's good.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I like it because it's just an example of sort of shifting from therapy as is, the commonplace ways, the attributions we make to the nervous system, for instance, right? And how our interventions are so often structured around that and ignore context, to saying that your support of these people really became about freely talking about the conditions of their life, the historical conditions of their life, became an exercise in actually wanting to understand, something more of, and even seeking it out. Like, not, this is important. It's actually essential that we talk about the historical context of your life, right, and the cultural context of your life. It's a beautiful example of shifting from a narrow attribution, something like, I mean, I say the nervous system just in the context of EMDR, right, to a very wide attribution where there's lots of possibilities that come from discussing one's cultural history. So,
and you can use metaphors like, what is it like to stand up against oppression? Or do you have other examples that we sometimes are talking about, poets or philosophers or civil rights leaders in their own country, right? Whether well known or just a cousin or another individual that was, standing up to give examples, of other possibilities. It's like, and they're out of that country now, thank goodness, but the internalized oppression is still there, but there might be learnings from that have never been gleaned or discussed, I think, in therapy or treatment as usual.
Yeah, you're opening our horizon where oppression can be alleviated, right, or worked through. Yeah. Well, thank you both for the lovely examples tonight. And I don't know about you boys, but I think we might have done it. I think we might be out of gas now. We covered as much as we could have. As a
I agree.
yeah, I will say, like, I think it's good to end with this final reflection of, this was one of the harder episodes we've ever produced. We definitely spent more time prepping for this episode and more time like revising our outlines and recording than we have with any other episode. And it really does speak, I think, Richard, like you brought up, to capitalist realism, that we're working against, I'm sure that's been all of our experience. We're actually working against a frame that actually wants
it's
to
like an active brain fog. I sometimes feel, right? That's a deep program.
It becomes very hard to talk about this stuff without falling into language that reproduces the cultural frame of consumerism. So it's exhausting. So thank you both for sticking through it. And I hope it was meaningful to our listeners. I hope the key points came through. And we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much to both of you for having me. And
thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, for joining us. And thank you for bringing the work of Philip Cushman to our podcast. It's immensely valuable. So thanks for being here with us tonight.
It was maybe the most exciting book club I've ever participated in.
There we go.
Yeah. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.